Welcome to another episode of The Brand Called You, a video and podcast show that brings you leadership lessons, knowledge, experience, and wisdom from hundreds of successful individuals from around the world. Today, I am delighted to welcome someone who loves outer space, Rod Pyle. Rod, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Rod is the editor-in-chief of the National Space Society print magazine and Astra. He's a space author, journalist, and a historian. He's the author of 17 books on space, worked on visual effects on Startrek and Battlestar Galactica, and he's the host of Cool Space News podcast. So, Rod, tell me, what would you say are three key milestones in your life or your career?
Well, I have one of those West Coast America Hollywood multi-hyphenate resumes. And so it's kind of hard to track those down, but I'll try. So when I was a very young man, I was a big astronomy buff. And one night in 1966, I was spending the night outside watching the sky, as I often did. And I knew there was a meteor shower that night. And it turned out it was the Great Leonid meteor shower, in which there were, instead of 1 or 2 per minute, like we would normally see for a meteor shower, there were thousands. And the sky just opened up and it looked like a miraculous event. And that really confirmed my interest in space and skies above. I also grew up, as you did, during the Apollo program, the space race, and was absolutely mesmerized by what was going on. And for people who are younger than us, it's hard to imagine, but as often as every 10 weeks to 2 months, these incredible missions of exploration were taking off for the moon. So I enrolled at UCLA in Los Angeles and decided I was going to be an astronomer. But differential calculus and I had a disagreement. And after a number of attempts at that, I said, okay, I'm either going to be a very average scientist or I'm going to be a media person. So I went into media, ended up graduating from a school called Art Center in California, and then went up to Stanford for my graduate work. And as you point out, had a number of different career paths. But I think the pivotal point came when I decided that I was a producer for a long time, TV commercials, visual effects, things of that nature, films. And I decided that it would be a lot more fun to be a creator than to be an enabler of creators. So I finally ginned up the courage. I was very scared that people weren't going to like what I did, but wrote that first book in 2004 and never looked back. I will say that book authoring is the fastest way to go from 6 figures to 5 in terms of income. But as you probably know from your own career, when you find that blissful path, there's no going back, because every day you're doing something else feels like you're waiting to go back to what you love.
Correct.
And so that was, I think, the final turn point.
Correct. So let's talk now about space. I mean, I was just mentioning to you before that I spent 8 years working for aerospace companies, and I've also been fascinated, but I did not have the courage to do what you have done. So, let's talk about...
And I didn't have the ability to do what you did, by the way. So we're even.
Okay. So, the fascination for space seems to have really picked up after man landed on the moon. I mean, I remember I was 13 years old, and in India we had a National Geographic record that had come to us, and we were listening to it live on radio. Why do you think humankind is so fascinated with space?
Well, in America, we like to sort of preserve this myth of moving towards the Western frontier. The Western frontier has been gone for a long time. Then a lot of people thought, well, the ocean's the next frontier. And in the 1960s, you probably remember, there was a lot of oceanic exploration going on, going to the deepest depths of the Challenger Deep and so forth. And Jacques Cousteau and the US Navy did their various undersea habitats. Turned out to not be a very welcoming place for people. In that same decade, of course, was the space race, when we really got our first toehold in low Earth orbit and then ultimately out to the moon and back. Unfortunately, the US government decided not to continue funding their lunar adventure. The Soviet Union hadn't had a lot of luck with their lunar program and concentrated on low Earth orbit. But I think once we sort of, as you kind of alluded to, once we sort of broke through that membrane of Earth orbit and went to the moon, it really fired a lot of people's imagination, including a couple of men called Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos. And in the case of those two guys, who are multi-billionaires, two richest men in the world now, they got tired of waiting for this adventure to continue and decided to put their money where their mouths were and do it themselves, and have been doing quite well. I think for the rest of us, it's just this, it's kind of the ultimate adventure. You know, there's certainly many adventures left to be had on Earth. Antarctica is on my bucket list, for example. I'm really anxious to get there before I'm too old to endure the cold. But space really is it. And when you start learning more about it and realizing what the benefits are that come from space exploration and space development, so many things we take for granted today, as you know, famously, including your smartphone and different parts of kidney dialysis and anti-scratch glass and all these different things, came from the space program in the early days. Since then, since the International Space Station has been up, which has been visited by Indian astronauts, we've learned a lot more about biomedical concerns that we had, wound healing, all kinds of artificial tissue growth, metallurgy, crystallography, all kinds of things that have come out of the space station. So between what we learn up there and what we learn down here, developing the tools we need to endure space, it's a tremendous forward advancement, not just for the technology and the commercial market, although it was really, in my opinion, the genesis of the digital environment that we live in today. But also it's been one of the greatest motivators for STEM education and related fields for decades. So there's just a whole bunch of things that come from that are beneficial.
So let me ask you a question that I've been asked by some of the naysayers who said too much money being spent. And I told them there's a lot of benefit coming from space. They said all the experiments that are done on the space, on the station, that can be simulated in zero gravity, no atmosphere on Earth. So why can't the same tests be replicated on Earth?
Well, if you want to create zero gravity on Earth, the only way to do it is to either cut the elevator cables and let it fall for 120 stories, which is a bad ending, or to go into a zero gravity plane, which will give you between 30 and 40 seconds of zero G during a parabola. Now, if you're trying to do studies on human organisms or rats or other kinds of lab animals, or slow growing crystals or something of that nature, you're not going to get that data from a zero gravity plane, because it's got to, you're only weightless while it's diving, and then it's got to pull out and go back up at 3 Gs, and it's a very painful experience. Is the crew from the movie
I couldn't
Apollo
explain it to them. You have, so thank you. That's a great, great answer. That's
a
great answer.
We don't have any zero gravity chambers on Earth. We do have vacuum chambers, but no zero gravity.
Fantastic. So now tell me about space from America and Russia, or USA and USSR in those days. It was a two-horse race. Now you've got, China came in big. India is spending a lot of money. Yesterday, the UAE has managed to send their aircraft to Mars, followed very quickly by China. Why is space becoming so critical for so many countries?
China's space program actually started about the same time the US and the Soviet Union did, but it progressed very slowly, had a lot of stops and starts, suffered under the Cultural Revolution and other upheavals there. India came along later, but India has really, I think, led the way for every country that came into this after the US and the USSR. Not that China hasn't done amazing things, but India has come a long way very quickly. You were the fourth party to reach Mars with an orbiter, but I believe the first to do it on the first try.
Correct.
And for significantly less money than the other parties, especially the US, to the extent that Jet Propulsion Laboratory, NASA's Field Center, where I used to work myself, is now cooperating on a program with India where there's design done in India and the US, and then assembly and fabrication done in India, and then the mission will be flown together because they realize what a great value it is and how much more science they can get for the money. So that's really a testament to the progress that's been made.
But, is it also important from a security perspective? I mean, President Trump actually signed off on a space force.
Yes.
So, is space so important from a security perspective for countries?
Well, your own country flew an anti-satellite test a couple of years ago. China's done theirs, Soviets and the Russians did theirs, and we've done our own here in the US. now there is so much business conducted in orbit, as you know,
Mm-hmm.
telecommunications, banking. There's all kinds of synchronizations done through satellites, many commercial entertainment streams, and critically transportation tracking, whether it's a train, a truck on a highway, or a ship at sea. Navigation and tracking is huge to those businesses, a lot of agricultural data, and of course, climate change data. So all those machines up there are very vulnerable. And whether it's a kinetic weapon or a laser or some other kind of energy pulse, they can be knocked out in a nanosecond by an unfriendly power. So being able to protect those assets has become very important, and China and Russia are ahead by many estimations of both your country and mine. So they felt it was important to catch up, and that the Air Force wasn't quite getting enough done in that area to keep people happy. It would be very unfortunate to have a space war, but I think this is more about defending assets than it is about aggressing against somebody else.
So, all the work that you did on Star Trek and Battlestar Galactica is going to wait with all those lasers flying back and forth, is it?
The ratings always add up when we had a war in space. That's why you saw so many.
Fair enough. So, a little while ago, you did speak about the private sector, Elon Musk and some of the other businessmen spending money on their own programs. What is your view on the privatization of the space program? I mean, so far it was always big governments.
Yeah, and it was interesting when I was writing my book Space 2.0 that came out last year. I interviewed representatives from India, from Europe, from a number of other nations, and the general consensus was that this has happened in the US first for a couple of reasons, but one of the big reasons is our tax structures allow people to have the kind of disposable revenue and to be able to spend it in a way that's effective without to their benefit. So when you look at Musk and Bezos, I mean, Musk gambled his entire fortune on SpaceX and very nearly went under in 2008. In fact, if it wasn't for a couple of investment groups, he may not have made it. Jeff Bezos, for the last 6 or 7 years, has been investing $1 billion of his own money every year by selling stock, which he can do, let's see, for about another 150 years without a problem.
Right.
And just recently stepped down from his company to put more time into his space efforts, which is fascinating. And we've found, and this is by NASA's own internal studies, that in the case of SpaceX, for instance, with the Falcon 9 and the Crew Dragon, which is now delivering both cargo and astronauts to the space station, that they can do that work effectively for between 1/2 and 1/10 of what it costs to do it the traditional way with US aerospace. So there's great value there. The trick and the sweet spot is finding that if you have a Venn diagram, there's 3 circles, right? One circle is NASA and the US government. The other circle is US private industry. And the third circle is international national space programs and international private suppliers. When you can find that perfect overlap, you've really got the magic.
Very interesting. So, 2 more questions on space before I move to some questions on your books.
Sure.
There's been a lot of talk of man going on to Mars and colony on Moon. Do you think that's feasible? And if so, what kind of time horizon should our listeners be thinking of?
This is always the question. Yes, I know it's feasible, and the studies have been done since the 50s. There's no lack of technology behind this. It's a lack of willpower and money. It is harder than we used to think. Space really does hate people. It just despises us. We're big, squishy bags of water, and between the vacuum and the temperature extremes and the radiation, space is a very hostile environment. That said, when you get to the Moon or Mars in particular, whether you're sheltering under mounds of dirt and rock on top of your structure, which shelter you from the temperature changes from meteorite impacts and from radiation, or whether you're down in caves, of which there are many, there are ways to live there successfully. Then the question becomes, what do we do once we're there? Of course, there's tons of science and research to be done, and that's very exciting. But what's got the private sector so engaged in this is we know on both the Moon and Mars, there are huge quantities of water in the form of ice. And when you've got water, you've got what you need to make rocket fuel, breathable oxygen, drinkable water, Both bodies also have metals and, of course, lots of silicate in the soil. We discovered more and more. In fact, I saw an Indian study recently that was talking about weaving lava rock, basalt, into fiber for cloth and making fiberglass structures and so forth. So there's a lot of resources out there, but water is the big one, because every gallon of water you don't have to launch off of Earth, whether it's in the form of rocket fuel or just water, is saving you between $10,000 and $15,000 at least.
Correct.
That adds up quickly.
Yep.
So when it's out there and you can create those things out there, now the solar system's your backyard and we can go anywhere we want, hopefully as an international consortium.
Interesting. And one more question, which I've been asked by several of our guests when some of them heard that you're going to be coming on the show. They spoke about space is getting littered.
Yes.
You know, so much debris all over the whole place. How dangerous is that for the assets, space assets that you just spoke about?
Very. In fact, we have to move the International Space Station fairly often to avoid impacts. And what a lot of people don't understand is, so there's thousands of tons of debris up there, whether it's exploded rocket stages, bits of ice from vented rocket fuel, even paint chips. And in fact, a flake of paint, just a single flake of paint about the size of a dime, cracked through the front window of the shuttle. Now there's 5 layers of glass on the shuttle.
Yeah.
So it wasn't a danger, but it put a significant divot in that front window. So because of these speeds, things going at 17,500 miles an hour in different directions,
correct,
it's very dangerous when you have debris. So there's a lot of work being done significantly by the Japanese, the Chinese, on orbital debris mediation. And again, the sweet spot, I'm always looking for sweet spots, because that's where you start combining things and getting real strength. The sweet spot is if you can gather that material. Now you could deorbit it or you can send it further out into space. It's your choice. But if you can gather that, most of it's metal. You've got all this metal up there. If you can gather that, smelt it, and 3D print it into new objects, you can build entire spacecraft out there. Split.
Yeah.
So that's what gets very exciting.
A lot of the satellites there, even if you could refuel them, they're as good as new.
Yeah. And the older ones we could just reprocess. Correct. But it's that the big objects are easy to track, and the U.S. Air Force and other agencies around the world track as many as they can, down to about the size of a baseball. But the small ones are very dangerous too.
Okay. So now I want to ask you 2 separate sets of questions. One is on your books, and second, I want to talk to you about your Star Trek and Battlestar Galactica. Okay. Tell me about your books.
Well, as I said, I started in 2004. First couple of books are done with a packager, which means that's somebody that goes between you and the publisher. And it wasn't the best financial arrangement, but it was a way to get into the marketplace. And back then, traditional publishing was a very hard market to crack, so I considered myself quite lucky. As time went on and Amazon came in and began to change the market, or as some publishers would say, stomp on the market, it's changed a lot. In general, authors are making less than they ever have. Average first-time author might get $5,000 up front for a book they've worked on for 2 or 3 years. You've been through this, I'm sure. On the other hand, the market's more democratized than ever. Anybody can write. Thousands of titles come onto the market every day.
Correct.
A lot of them aren't very good. But if you've got something to say, you have a way to get your voice out there. And that's true for radio, through podcasting, and through video, through places like YouTube. So I think it's a wonderfully vibrant time in publishing. The only thing I think we miss are the gatekeepers. Now, the people, editors, and so forth, who used to make these decisions about what got printed and what didn't, or now what went digital and what didn't. But I've always worked for traditional publishing houses. I've just been lucky. And there are probably easier ways to make a living, because, as you know, writing is a very grueling and demanding endeavor. But it is such a wonderful thing to do. And I can't imagine anything better than a solo creative experience, because in my experience anyway, the editors have been incredibly supportive. They might say, well, can you use another word there? Or can you move part of this in another chapter? But once you've agreed on the story you're going to tell, they let you tell it. And I've coached a lot of authors on this. And one of the things that comes up a lot is writer's block, which I think happens in fiction more than nonfiction. I've never experienced it personally. I just sit down and I write, and I know some of it's not going to make it the final book, but it really is just about getting the words down on paper or on the electronic page and getting it out there. And I think everybody's got at least one decent book in them. It's just the courage to sit down and do it.
Fabulous. So my next question to you is your experience on Star Trek and Battlestar Galactica. Tell me
Yes, sir.
about how you got involved and maybe an interesting story.
I was running the production department of a company that made TV commercials in Los Angeles.
Hmm.
We were the largest company of that sort at the time. It was a very harrowing job.
Hmm.
And my camera assistant went off and got a job in the visual effects department on Star Trek: The Next Generation.
Okay.
And I was tired of the job I had. It was a high blood pressure kind of assignment. And excuse me. And I said, I really, really want to work on Star Trek. Is
Hmm.
there something you could do? And it took a long time, but finally he got me on to the last few episodes of Next Generation. And then I was on Deep Space Nine for 3 seasons.
Hmm.
And that was the end of the era of the physical model before we went into using computer graphics.
Okay.
So we had a physical Enterprise D.
Wow.
We had a physical Enterprise A from the movie. We had a physical Klingon ship, which may actually be in my closet as we speak. I'm not telling.
Okay.
But that was just an incredible time. And I will relate one quick story in terms of Star Trek. There was a Sunday where we had agreed to shoot a book cover for Simon & Schuster, which was the publisher that worked at Paramount.
Yeah.
And I arrived at the set a little late. It was just myself and the effects supervisor I worked with.
Hmm.
And he had already set up the Enterprise 1701A, which was from that first movie.
Hmm.
And I arrived at the stage. I walked in. It was a summer day, so I went from full sunlight to complete dark.
Hmm.
As my eyes adjusted in the middle, and he did this on purpose just for me, in the middle of the stage, it was completely dark, but here was the Enterprise. That model of the 1701A for the first movie cost $180,000 in 1977.
Wow.
And no matter how close you got to it, it looked perfect.
Wow.
And I almost cried. It was such an emotional moment.
Incredible. Incredible. So Rod, I'm now going to move to a few questions for you personally. My first question is, as you look back, and you and I are the same vintage, uh, you know, life keeps changing us. But as you look at where you stand today, what does success mean to you?
I was kind of agonizing over this question because I don't want to sound trite, but it's doing what you love.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not true for everybody, but in my case, there was a significant financial trade-off because I knew that book writing wasn't going to make a lot of money. It does turn out that once you've written a book, as I'm sure you know and have experienced, you suddenly become an expert in that field and you can start doing talks. And probably half my income comes from doing talks. It's very lucrative until COVID, of course. But it's just such a wonderful thing. You can arrange your own schedule. You can indulge in the subjects that fascinate you. I have adult ADD, which was diagnosed late in life because my son had it fairly profoundly. And so I'm the kind of person that's constantly interested in 100 different things. But when I pick one to focus on, it's like drilling for oil. I just go right down to the bottom. I'm a perfectionist. I will stay up 24 hours to get it done. And so this has been the lifestyle that really made that possible.
Amazing.
And like I said, I changed careers a lot. I ran a casting agency for a while in Hollywood, worked in visual effects, worked TV commercials, worked in the movie industry for a bit. I tried all kinds of things.
Fantastic.
I enjoyed them all, but the only one that really found a home in my heart was writing books and now editing at Astra magazine.
Fantastic. So now my last question to you, and this is a question on failure. In the world that I live in Asia, parents don't teach children it's okay to fail. And that manifests itself in our behavior patterns. We are always taught to come first, head of the line, etc., etc. Yet we fail and we keep carrying on. My question to you, Rod, is what have been some of your learnings from some of your mistakes?
Well, again, you probably had experience with this. You put any creative work out in a public forum,
Correct.
and there are going to be people that don't like it.
Absolutely.
They may take offense at, and this particular happens in book reviews on Amazon and some of the big book chains. The first reviews that go up when the book is released stay there for the next 10 years. They don't go away.
Correct.
So I did a space book year before, about the Apollo program. And one guy, retired engineer, I used to work for the History Channel, and we called these guys the rivet counters, pointed out gross errors that said made the book a total failure. Don't buy it because, for instance, I used the word fuel instead of propellant.
Oh, I see.
And I called him and I pointed out that to the average person, that is not a significant distinction. And I am writing for general audience. So he softened quite a bit, but he never amended his review. I went so far as to get the publisher to correct some of the things he pointed out. There were a couple of real errors in the next edition. It was went through 6 printings. He never changed his review. So you have to grow pretty thick skin.
Correct.
So I think there's a moment where you feel like you failed, but it's a matter of adjusting your perspective. The other thing I'd say is, if I had a failure, it was an overarching one, which was fear. I was very fearful of putting myself out there. I didn't think I could do it. I didn't think I had an individual, unique voice. I didn't think I had the stuff to make it in that marketplace. And it was just a matter of saying it became too important to not do. And you just have to grow a thicker skin. And I'm sure we both experienced that many times.
Wonderful. Rod, thank you so much. It's been such a pleasure speaking to you. I mean, you've taken me back to when I was working in aerospace, and I thought I'd lost touch with that, but you've really reintroduced that passion for me. Thank you again, and good luck with everything that you're doing.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate being here.
Thank you for listening to the Brand Called You videocast and podcast, a platform that brings you knowledge, experience, and wisdom of hundreds of successful individuals from around the world. Do visit our website www.tbcy.in to watch and listen to the stories of many more individuals. You can also follow us on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Just search for the Brand Called You.